This is an introduction to the monthly topic on Patrick Lecture 108, which is the fundamental guilt for not loving. Now, sometimes when you read these lectures, it feels like they're pointing out all the bad stuff. Look at this guilt, look at this fear, look at whatever. I invite you to consider guilt as a message. So similarly, pain is a message. If you feel physical pain, it's a message from your body. Stop doing that. If you feel emotional pain, it's a sign that something's not aligned, something's not correct. There's some confusion. There's something wrong, something to be addressed. I've always loved the phrase cognitive dissonance, which is a word to describe intellectual pain, where you have two ideas and they're in conflict, but you can't figure out why they're in conflict. And your mind it hurts to hold both these ideas. And what we do sometimes to relieve the cognitive dissonance is we simply discard one set of facts, one viewpoint, one reality, and accept the other because it's easier. And so going back to guilt. Guilt is a message. Guilt says you didn't do as much as you could have. I invite you to see that from a positive perspective. You're not doing as much as you could have. How do you know what you could have done? As an invitation for you to realize that you do know that you weren't at your best in that moment. So translating the title, Fundamental Guilt for Not Loving, it's a universal sense that we were not as loving as we could be. So with many life activities, they become automated. When you drive, when you walk, when you ride the subway or the bus, when you first do it, you're looking at everything. It's very confusing. But eventually, you have a sixth sense about where your stop is, how to apply brakes and accelerator, and the route that you take, even if you're walking, the route that you take, so that you're not fully conscious of what you're doing. However, when something goes wrong, you have a heightened awareness. Consider that guilt is a form of heightened awareness, an invitation for you to look at something because it's not going the way you have an internal sense in you of your values and beliefs, and something's not right. Okay? One of the easiest ways to work with this is to just boil it down to a simple exercise. When you feel disharmony, when you feel guilt, when you feel pain or dissension of any kind, to ask yourself, what would love do here? Now, you may not be able to do this in the moment. Sometimes you'll have to do it 5 minutes later, an hour later, a day later. But to consider, what would the most loving thing to do be? To review the situation and consider that you were being a little contracted, a little fearful, not loving, you were pulling away a little bit, and to ask yourself, what if I was more open, more present, more willing, more cooperative? In a loving sense, what if I was more loving in that situation, more accepting of other people? What could have been possible? And my invitation is that when we take that perspective, you don't have to act on it. It's important to consider it first. And then perhaps at another time, you might be able to act on it. To ask yourself, what would love do? Am I being fearful? Am I being overly self-interested? Well, what if my interest was including the others? It was, the phrase might be enlightened self-interest. I'm included, but it's also in the self-interest of others. So the exercise is to ask, what would love do here? Or words of your choosing. Another way of working with this is to include Patrick Lecture 30, which is the lecture on pride, self-will, and fear. I did a search at some point in the lectures and was really surprised to find how many times the guide specifically mentioned those three, pride, self-will, and fear, as being problems. So what does that mean? It means that when we are acting, we may be acting out of fear of something else rather than what we're seeing as a solution to fear. So I may do something, I'm not doing it because I want to, I'm doing it because I'm afraid of something else. In self-will, I'm doing it because I need to be in charge, I need to be in control, rather than consider other alternatives that might be better suited for the moment. And pride, meaning I have to be better than other people. I can't admit I make a mistake. One of the things that I learned in these presentations that other people learn in other speaking environments is don't get hung up on a mistake. If you misspeak, if you say something wrong, if you speak clumsily, just move on. If you want to admit it, fine, but just move on. Don't get so hung up on fixing that mistake, that poorly chosen word, that clumsy phrase, that you've taken your eyes, in effect, off the road. There's another phrase that's used when they talk about airline pilots and airline accidents, and they say somebody needs to keep flying the plane. So there was an airline accident 20 years ago. That plane crashed because everybody in the cockpit was looking at some small detail in the cockpit, and nobody was flying the plane. So my invitation here is to use this lecture, Fundamental Guilt for Not Loving, as a suggestion to accept guilt as a reminder, as a message that something needs to be addressed. And instead of curling up in shame, oh my gosh, I'm not loving enough, to consider, what would be loving enough? What would be a more loving attitude in this given situation? So I hope you download the study guide, and I hope you download the full lecture from the Pathwork Foundation website, www.pathwork.org. Thanks.